Welcome everyone to the second installment of the Home Improvements training series. Tonight we're going to talk about common retrofit measures. And a recap again of who we are. So myself and Steve work at the Centre for Sustainable Energy in Bristol, and CSE supports people and organisations across the UK with a dual goal of tackling climate change and ending the suffering caused by cold homes. We're quite a big organization. We have a retrofit advisor team and a research team. We also have a community engagement team, which Steve and I are a part of, and a team of energy advisors who give people direct one-to-one advice if they're struggling to pay their fuel bills, for example. So for my background, I have worked at CSC for a few years in the community engagement team, and I've had the pleasure of learning about lots of different aspects of the Centre for Sustainable Energy's work. And just this past year, I've been working with Steve on this project, which is about retrofit in traditional buildings, focusing on the west of England and North Somerset region. So everything we're talking about tonight is also quite new for me, which is really exciting to talk about. And then Steve, do you want to talk about your background?
Yeah, I'm Steve. I suppose, a builder by background. I've worked a lot with traditional buildings. I'm also a retrofit coordinator, and I've studied sustainability and adaptation in the built environment. So yeah, I do know some stuff, but by all means don't know it all. So if I do say anything that you've sort of been taught otherwise, then do ask the question. It's always worth it. Yeah.
So the same as with part one, hopefully this training will provide an overview of home renovation. We're going to talk about the pros and cons of common measures that you'll see and common issues to look out for. In the next week's training, part three, there'll be a practical survey which you can use to look at your home. And hopefully at the end, even if you don't feel confident doing your whole retrofit yourself, you'll know the right questions to ask the tradespeople or DIY yourself. This training will not cover detailed advice for DIY or replace the advice of a qualified professional, and it's not going to make you an expert. So maybe that means no pressure. We do recommend that after you've done the online series with us, come and join us at an in-person event. There's lots of green open home events happening. Some of you might be here because you've been working with Bath and West Community Energy or Bristol Energy Network, and they are very knowledgeable on this as well. So do go to one of their events and pepper them with your questions. All right. Yes, we're doing part two, and that's what we did last week, and also what we're going to do next week. And tonight, we are going to go through understanding heat and moisture in our homes, ventilation, draft proofing, very hot topics at the moment, insulation. And we'll also briefly run over things to think about with heat pumps, solar PV, and heating controls. Okay, recapping last week. Steve, I think this one's yours.
So, yeah, I suppose the main functions of a building, why we have them, keep the inhabitants dry and try and keep them warm. Yeah, it's just important to try and remember the basics, I suppose.
This is the basics, so I guess that's where we have to start, isn't it?
So,
Oh wait, no, you go.
uh, happy to let you go. I suppose, yeah, quick recap. I think a lot of you were there last week, but yeah, adapting our buildings for climate change. We do need to think about its operational energy efficiency, which is the common one, which is the one that most people sort of think about. But then we also need to think about things like flood prevention and mitigation, particularly myself, because I live in a flood zone. Um, Particularly in parts of North Somerset, areas that are exposed to high levels of wind-driven rain, that can often lead to us making different decisions. And then our weather is getting a bit more unpredictable. So we have increased rainfall and intensity of rainfall. So we need to be thinking about our guttering and our drainage. We don't get it very often, but when it is hot, we do need to think about overheating risks. and increased relative humidity, increasing the likelihood of mold in our home.
Hmm. So while retrofit, I guess, for energy efficiency is always great for reducing our impact on climate change in general, there is the added element of the impacts of climate change right now are impacting the west of England and North Somerset. So we should be thinking about that on a local scale as well. Oh, this is the science part that Steve does.
And I don't have my notes for this, so let's see how we go.
All right.
Um, I think it's just, yeah, I don't think we need to understand all of this, but it is quite helpful because I think certainly in our homes, things often get confusing. We have things like radiators in our homes that don't actually work via radiation. They tend to work via convection. So there's a bit of confusing terminology. I find that cooking comparisons can help with this. So for anybody that has used an old electric hob, they work via radiation. And then we heat the water up, and that works via convection. And sometimes if you've got really bad pans, my mum has them, and the handle gets really hot as well. So that bit's the radiation. And that's important for a few different things. But I will not try and make this too complicated. So I'm hoping that's okay.
Yeah.
Hoping so.
You have in your notes here that different kinds of heating make different
Okay.
substances warmer faster, which is why it's relevant for
Hey, yeah,
um
no, it's one of those things I think we all conduction in terms of heat loss through things like walls. But then it's also bear in mind that our heating systems, or most of our heating systems, work via convection. And our EPCs, they generally concern themselves with heat loss through conduction, which is where we get some of um, the calculated figures for heat loss through walls. Um, it's important to remember that they can all happen at the same time. And I think I'm right by saying that heat usually tries to um, move from hot to cold. It doesn't go the other way around unless it's forced. But it usually tries to do that through the easiest method possible. So I suppose there's no point in getting too focused on heat loss through walls if we've always got the window open because the heat is just going to go out the window because it's the easiest way for the heat to escape. So it's that there's something to do with the balance here, and yeah, heat is always trying to find a balance and go from hot to cold.
mm,
So yeah, I think the point is we can try our best with our homes, but they will always lose some amount of heat because that's the law of nature and that's the law of heat transfer physics. Thermal comfort. I find this an interesting one, and the definition of it is it's a condition of the mind that expresses satisfaction with the environment. There's a very sort of simple way. I think lots of people generally say, "Oh, you should heat your house to somewhere between 18 and 21." Um, but that will depend on people, and that will depend on quite a few other things. So we have the air temperature, which is the one that most of us would sort of relate to thermal comfort. But we also have airspeed. We also have the amount of clothing that we wear, or personal insulation, as some people call it. Humidity also impacts upon this. What sort of activities we're doing. So if we're running around or if we're stationary, we're producing a different amount of heat from our bodies. And then also what sort of surfaces we surround ourselves with. So if you imagine you're in a room with lots of nice carpet, with big thick underlay and lots of heavy curtains, um, will feel a bit warmer than if we were in an old church with a stone floor and bare stone walls because they're colder surfaces. So I think it's just quite important to think about that airspeed bit because that sort of comes back to our draft proofing. Um, and I used to live near the sea in Wales, and it was always interesting because you could go out, look outside of the window, it looks like a nice sunny day. You go outside, you don't take a jumper, you walk around, it feels fine. you turn the corner and all of a sudden you've got the wind coming in from the ocean and you feel cold. So the air temperature is still the same. It's just the wind speed that's different that's making us feel colder. So I hope that makes sense.
I think it definitely does make sense, especially when we're thinking about making our homes energy efficient with regards to heating, aiming for what we're thermally comfortable with rather
Y-
than some uh, standard goal of 21 degrees in the lounge room during the day.
Yeah, I mean, the house I live in, I don't think, yeah, it's very often above 18, but most of us wear slippers and jumpers, and we can't all go around telling people to wear these clothes and do this and that, but it's just, it's worth bearing in mind that it is different, and maybe being dressed appropriately is somehow good advice.
Hmm. I guess there will also be some people for whom they need to be a warmer temperature for health reasons. But
Yes.
yeah, I guess that's where it's the within your own mind, your satisfaction, your comfort in your environment.
Yeah.
This
Um,
is the slide that this is the slide that we talked back and forth about whether to include.
yeah, I think if we did talk about EPCs last week, and EPCs they use sort of off-the-shelf data that they put into calculations, and they attempt to calculate the heat loss of a building. Um, and I don't want people to get too hung up about them, which is why it's sort of kind of blurred out. Because these calculations they ignore moisture for a start. So if you've got things like wet walls, these calculations will be incorrect. Um, they also don't include drafts. So whilst we can try and calculate your EPC for a building, if you've got a very drafty building, that's not taken into consideration. The condition of your building's not taken into consideration. So there are lots of people that spend lots of times working on these calculations, which is fine, but I don't think we should put all of our eggs in one basket and place too much emphasis on these calculations because they're quite often misleading. So we just want to people to be aware of what U values are, how an EPC is calculated, but also sort of it's not the end of the world. And I think yeah, there's a phrase, don't go chasing U values, which lots of people tend to do, but yeah, just so you're aware of how they're done. And I think this is a repeat slide from last week, but this is just going back to that point. So when we measure energy loss in a building, it's quite often different from when we calculate it, I think for the reasons we've just spoke about. So um, yeah, don't bet the house on your EPC. There's other surveys that can help. Um, and yeah, just to recap, older buildings, if they're in a good condition, they generally perform better than the EPC suggests, whereas newer buildings generally perform worse than the EPC suggests. So yeah, that was I think the blue bars on here are actual measured energy, whereas the green are predicted energy. So you can see with quite a few of these cases, there's actually quite a big difference.
And we do talk about that in the previous week as well. So if this is your first time watching this, do go back and watch part one. And like Steve is saying, we can chase U values and follow the recommendations of our EPC certificates, which are every home that is either leased or sold should have an EPC certificate in date. But if we have damp walls or disrepair, then the calculations aren't going to take that into account.
Yeah, and just I suppose one more point on that is an EPC doesn't consider how you actually use energy in your home. So you could live you and your neighbor could have very, very similar homes, but you could live very different lifestyles, have different people in the house. So you're actually using energy very, very differently to your neighbor. So it's don't always judge everything by your EPC.
Okay, so this all leads us to moisture, which is the I don't know the heavy hitter of tonight. So Worldwide moisture is the leading cause of building defects, and there's four places that moisture gets into our buildings from. The first one being liquid water, quite obviously from rain, snow, but also from leaks, and what we're doing inside the house if we're mopping the floor. Then there's water vapor, which most people know that you need to open a window or turn on a extractor fan if you're having a shower. But also we breathe out moisture all the time when we're just breathing and doing things like drying laundry or cooking. There's also liquid and water vapor from outside, and there can be moisture built in during the construction process. To explain this, there's a very handy video from an organisation called the UK Centre for Moisture Control in Buildings. Is that what it's called? UK
Okay, Centre
Centre
for
for...
Moisture in Buildings.
Yeah, fantastic organisation with this pre-prepared video. So we're just going to play this because they explain it much better than us.
Don't panic.
Yep,
Help
good.
is at hand.
Great.
First off, we need to understand what the problem is. Damp and mould are caused by an excess of moisture and can create problems for our health and for our buildings. However, just like our bodies, we need some moisture in our houses in order for them to function well. So we need a balanced amount of moisture to keep a healthy home. Moisture can create problems in your home through the many forms water can take. When water freezes, it expands into solid ice, which can burst uninsulated pipework. Liquid water from leaks or flooding can lead to damp in the floors or walls. If your guttering becomes blocked, then rainwater can overflow, saturating your walls in specific areas, sometimes even leaking through to the inside. But the most important form we want to discuss here is water as a gas, water vapour. Whilst we're all used to the sight of steam from a boiling kettle, most water vapour is not so easy to spot. There is always water vapour in the air around us. We produce it when we breathe, along with any animals or plants in our home, and also through daily activities such as cooking and washing. If there was no water vapour in the air, then nothing would be able to live. Okay, so here's the technical bit. At different temperatures, air can hold different amounts of water vapour. The warmer the air is, the more moisture it can hold, known as its holding capacity. But when there is more water vapour than can be held by the air, it becomes full up and condenses into liquid water. Outside of your home, this is how rain is formed. This also happens when warm, moisture-rich air meets a cold surface, like a single glazed window in your home during winter. Condensation forms as the air suddenly cools against the surface and the holding capacity of the air is reduced. Because air can hold different amounts of moisture at different temperatures, we measure how full the air is by something called relative humidity. If we have 100% relative humidity, then the air is full up and the vapour becomes liquid water. But even when there is no condensation, high relative humidity can be uncomfortable and lead to mould and other problems. At the other end of the scale, air with 0% relative humidity is excessively, and in fact impossibly dry and uninhabitable. We need a relative humidity of somewhere between 40% and 65% for most of the time for the building atmosphere to be pleasant and healthy. So we come back to balance. Not too dry and not too moist. Where does the moisture in your house come from? Outside of the home, the most obvious answer is rain. Good construction is vital to avoid water entering a building from the roof, walls and windows, along with suitable ground drainage in the case of flooding. Inside, we have our direct uses of water in our daily lives, washing and drying clothes, cooking and bathing. All these produce visible liquid water and large amounts of not so visible water vapour. Next, we have the organisms within the home: human, animal and plant. All of us produce water vapour as we breathe, or plant breathe. If the number of people, pets or plants changes, the balance of moisture within your home may change dramatically. Remember how hot and humid the air gets at busy parties. But you didn't have a problem before. What's changed? For damp and mould to appear in your home, you need an excess of moisture, visible or not, that leads to an imbalance. What has changed? Has something stopped working? Has the weather changed? Or have you changed the way you live? Or have you made improvements to your home? Home improvements need attention to detail, as sometimes they can put things out of balance. For example, improving windows or insulation is great for heat retention, but if the installation leaves gaps, it can create colder areas, called cold bridges, where the moisture can condense and mould can grow. If you draft-proof your home but ventilation is not also considered, then moisture levels can rise and push the house out of balance. So a good ventilation strategy is needed. Different types of building in different locations need different approaches in order to maintain balance. Older buildings deal with moisture in a different way to newer ones, so require a different approach when renovations or changes are made. Buildings in windy, wet places often have different kinds of materials and design. If we don't take these into account when we change things, we can end up creating more problems. What to do about it? There's a lot to think about, but the key is to hold on to the idea of balance. The balance between the water, outside and in, your house, and your activities. Firstly, understand your building and how it was designed to work and stay healthy. Try to understand the building as a whole, fabric, services, occupants, and its context, as all these factors are connected. Try to stop any excess water getting into your home, from the roof, windows, walls, or foundations, and also the internal plumbing. Check for leaks, missing tiles on the roof, broken seals around windows, and cracks in the render. This is obvious, but not always straightforward. Simple maintenance is always a good starting point. Try to reduce the excess moisture from your activities within the home, for example, by keeping lids on pans or drying clothes outside. This is not always easy in winter or if you have limited space, but do what you can. Finally, make sure the water vapour generated in your home stays at a healthy level through proper heating to increase the holding capacity in the air, and good ventilation to get rid of excess vapour. Try to understand your home's ventilation system if it has one. This can mean opening windows when you know an excess of vapour is being created. It's easier to heat your house if it's well insulated, of course, but remember that a consistent approach should be taken so that you don't have an imbalance of warm and cold surfaces. One more thing. Don't worry about little bits of damp or mould, particularly around windows or in showers and bathrooms. It's quite normal, especially in extreme weather conditions. Sometimes there is not much you can do except wipe the water or mould away. Just keep an eye on things and ask an expert if you're not sure. To learn more about the causes of damp and the balance of actions, check out our tool here. Living in a balanced home is good for the health of the building, its occupants, and their wallets.
I always love that video because it makes a lot of very complicated things presented in a nice sort of digestible fashion. So yeah, and do check them out. They do have lots of good research and resources around mold and damp and moisture in buildings.
Speaking of mold, that's what we've got next.
Hey, so it was interesting in the video about the sort of don't worry about small amounts. It's a tricky thing that I think I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what is a safe amount. But there isn't any sort of standard safe amount because human beings have evolved over time with mold and fungi, and yeah, it can often be made worse by climate change, different weather, higher humidities. So the health risks of it are known, but it does change from person to person. So I suppose a bit like COVID, if you've got people with slightly more vulnerable immune systems, they're going to be more susceptible to things. And it can be a bit of a tricky one. But certainly if you've got lots of big patches of mold, it's worth trying to figure out why that is and how to deal with it. Simple relative humidity monitors and temperature monitoring can be really, really helpful in a home. I've lived in homes before where I wasn't able to dry washing outside because it was a rented place. We didn't have space. So it can just be knowing it's an issue or can be an issue, being aware of it. If you do have really high relative humidity, open a window, air your house out. There's lots of sort of simpler things that you can do. And then the last bit on here is it is quite a scary thing because it can grow in human lungs and it is really bad for people. So yeah, do take it seriously, do be aware of it, and do try and monitor it if you can.
Got on the lower end before it gets into your lungs. It's also increasing eczema and asthma and just a
Yeah,
lot of
there's
things. So
yeah, no,
that's
there's
quite
lots
common,
of
isn't it?
yeah.
Yeah. And I think we'll get into this more, but you will have probably seen news articles about people who've put in lots of insulation or people who've had insulation put into their homes inappropriately while their building is still damp or without enough ventilation, and that leading to mold. So that kind of is the
Yeah, I
really
just
classic poor retrofit
yeah, I think
outcome.
just on that, just to make it really, really, really clear, adding insulation to a building does not fix damp problems. Fixing damp problems fixes damp problems, and for that you need to sort of understand what the cause is. So don't be fooled by anybody that offers to fix damp problems with insulation because it doesn't work.
And why doesn't it work, Steve? Tell me about waterproofness.
Oh, so
That was a great segue.
I didn't even mean that one. Waterproofness, yeah, I don't think it's a proper word. There's lots of different words that people like to use. You might come across the term breathable materials. We come across it a lot with clothing and coats and hiking boots and things like that, because if you're breathable, then yeah, your feet don't sweat as much. Well, it's exactly the same thing for buildings. So particularly building materials. So the old grey coat on the left there, that tends to represent buildings that are traditionally constructed, which I'm not sure if we did cover last week. There isn't any sort of set cut-off point for that. It generally tends to be what your building is made from. Traditional materials, things like lime mortar, stones, bricks, will represent the grey coat, so they will let water in, but when the rain stops and the sun shines, we can dry out again. Whereas the modern plastic, not breathable raincoat on the right there, that tends to represent our modern buildings and a lot of our modern building materials that are more waterproof. Which is fine if they're in good condition, but if they get any cracks or holes in, the water can come inside. Um, when the rain stops and the sun comes out, we can't dry out again because we're covered with a waterproof material. So it's just sort of trying to understand that, and it's quite important. Going back to what we were just saying about adding insulation to damp buildings. Um, sorry. Water conducts heat 25 times faster than air. So damp buildings or damp building fabric equals cold fabric equals increased heat loss. So back to our EPC, if our walls are damp, we're going to be losing heat a lot quicker than our EPC suggests. If our walls are in good condition, they'll be a lot drier and probably perform a lot better.
I think we've got a picture here of the traditional stone wall versus a stone wall that's had like a waterproof render on it.
Yeah, and it's a common thing, and unfortunately, it is quite common that people will cover up the image on the right with more insulation, thinking that's going to make it warmer. It won't if that moisture is trapped inside the wall. So quite often, with a lot of work that I used to do on old buildings is removing a lot of things like cement renders, fixing gutters, fixing broken tiles, fixing drainage problems, and then that allows the building to dry. A lot of our old buildings get a bad reputation for being damp and cold. It's usually because they've been covered with the wrong materials. So quite often, removing some of the materials, allowing them to dry will make them a lot drier, which will also make them warmer, and it will also make them more energy efficient. So that's quite an important thing to keep in mind.
Right, I'm going to race through this because I think we've got quite a few slides coming up.
Okay.
But we're about to talk about a few of the different things that are common retrofit measures. But just before we get into that, Steve and I wanted to reiterate the whole house approach, which we talked a lot about last week. But the whole house approach means looking at everything that's going on in your building rather than just focusing on draft proofing or just focusing on insulating your walls. As we're saying, if you just do something like that without thinking about the way that moisture travels through your home, you could get a damp problem or you could have a mold problem, for example. So again, this is the same as last week, but a whole house approach means thinking about the services in your home. So what's that? Plumbing,
Heating, electrics, yep.
heating, what's coming in and out of your home. The fabric, so that means the walls, the roof, the floor, the doors, the windows, the outside envelope of your home. And then the use and the people crosses over a lot, but it's who's living in your house and how are they using it. So you're looking for a balanced solution. All right, let's get into this, Steve, because I know we've already somehow chewed up 40 minutes. So
Okay, let's try and be quick. Drafts and draft proofing. There's lots of people out there just say, yeah, go for your draft proofing. It's generally a good idea if you've got a really drafty house, but we have to understand that there is a difference between a draft and ventilation. So I think in that video it talked a lot about ventilation systems. Some houses have them, some houses don't. But again, we said about monitoring temperature and humidity. That can be really helpful with determining if something is an unwanted draft or a welcome draft needed to ventilate your home. So yeah, it'll be different for your different homes, which is why the monitors can be quite good. Yeah.
I think this one's me, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, the reason that draft proofing is like often the first point of call when people are talking about improving the energy efficiency in their home is because it's very effective and quite cheap. It's easy to do. So yeah, we just got to find that balance between avoiding excess heat loss and making the air too stale inside or too humid inside because there's not enough ventilation. So you can get these monitors that show the air quality in your home. Steve and I were just talking before this call about whether there's places people can borrow them from and just test the air quality in your home. I think they're about the cheap ones are like £30. I feel like
Yeah,
you
and
can
I
also feel when the air quality is quite poor.
I was talking to somebody else about this the other week, and it's not that we need to be too scientific about it because I've got lots of different monitors, and sometimes the readings are different. But it's just noticing if it has gone up a lot, then what's caused that, and just being aware that it has gone up a lot as opposed to scientifically analyzing different bits. Yeah.
Yeah. And then these photos that have just popped up. Obviously, there's the mechanical vent, but then a lot of windows have trickle vents in them, like the red circled one up the top here. Or just opening a window. Oh, that's not a trickle vent, is it? That's just a regular window getting opened. But all good examples of ventilation. Speaking of windows, right, let's talk about windows.
Okay. I suppose everybody's first thought with Windows seems to be I need new ones. And it just to sort of point out that it's not always the case. There's lots of things you can do to existing windows. Draft proofing, obviously, one of them. Even things like curtains. We were out with a community group the other week, and a lady was telling us how over winter she actually doubles up and puts an old pair of curtains behind a new pair. So there are simpler things that can have actual meaningful improvements for comfort and reduce energy use. Then there's things like secondary glazing, which if you've got particularly nice old fancy windows, or if you live in a conservation area, or if you have a listed building, you'll usually be encouraged to do. If you are going for new windows, just be mindful how they're fitted, is really important. You can spend lots of money on fancy windows, fit them badly, and they still might not really help. And then, yeah, for new windows as well, just keeping in mind UPVC windows, they do come from fossil fuels. They're not easily repaired, so they often have to be replaced, and their lifespan isn't always the longest. triple glazing's an interesting one because I know lots of people assume it's very good, which it can be for heat loss and comfort. But we need to be mindful that quite often the energy used to manufacture it is not always saved through the duration, or sorry, through the lifespan of the thing. So I suppose it's just bearing in mind energy efficiency is slightly different to sustainability. So yeah, we've all got different motivations for doing stuff, but just other things to keep in mind.
And the pictures on here, down the bottom is an example of draft proofing foam that can be just DIY installed onto your window, around the window frame to sort of block out drafts. And then the one with the bunting flag is an example of secondary glazing where, correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, but it's an additional window frame has been put on the inside of the building. So it's
There are a few different ways of doing it. It sort of depends on your budget. Yeah, but just don't overlook them.
don't
There are
overlook
more and more
curtains.
options. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess windows are tricky as well. If you've got like a bay window and things like that, it all ties together. But I guess we'll come to that when we talk about insulation. So doors, similarly to the windows, how well your door is fitted will greatly impact whether it lets in a lot of cold air that you don't want. Again, you can get brushes or draft strips to go underneath your door over your mail. What do we call that? Letterbox.
Yeah.
And I think this one's quite funny, Steve, about if you want a high U value door, but then you put a cat flap in it, you're not really getting a warmer door.
Yeah, and I've done it myself. I remember working at my mum and dad's house. We got a fancy new door. Spent ages thinking about what's the best thermal efficient door, and then hadn't really considered. We're still putting a letterbox in it. That's still putting a big hole in it. So yeah, just things to bear in mind, I suppose.
Okay, so this slide is a click through of the many different kinds of insulation that you can get. Some you might already have, you very likely will already have some of these kinds of insulation in your home, but if you're thinking about um, different insulation types, maybe you'll come across something new. Right. Steve, I think you should do the talking for this one.
I'm not going to talk through loads. Do you want to bring them up?
Okay, so these are all the fossil fuel based ones, I guess.
Well, the mineral wool, I think, is well, not necessarily fossil fuel based. But I suppose it's more the PIR and the polystyrene stuff that you tend to see more commonly. Arguably not really suitable for insulating walls of traditional buildings, but people still use them quite a lot, and unfortunately, they're the most common ones used. It's quite tricky sort of in the world of retrofit because often what you find on the internet and what different people tell you might not necessarily be the best thing to do for your house. Um, but things like mineral wool and glass fiber, are not particularly nice to work with, having worked with them before, but quite common and somehow, yeah, still okay to use in lots of places like loft insulation and stuff like that. But does the next slide have different materials? Ah, yeah, there we go. So it's just sort of reminding people that there are other alternatives, things like sheep's wool. You can get lots of British sheep's wool. It does need to be treated, but it's a lot nicer for the person that's actually installing it. And it's if you do spend much time up in your loft, it's a lot better for you. And then there's things like cork boards. There's also wood fiber boards. There's lots of other different materials that are from more renewable, sustainable sources that are worth considering.
So in that instance, it comes back to the whole house approach as well, because um, if for example, it's not within your budget and you need to reduce your energy bills immediately for the like the well-being of your household, then obviously you're going to go for the insulation that's within your budget. Um,
But it's
rather
just,
than,
yeah,
yeah,
it's just being mindful of that waterproofness thing again,
yeah.
particularly when you're looking at things like walls, it becomes more important, less so with lofts. So insulation coverage. Me and Kate were just talking because Kate's taken a thermal imaging camera around her own home. And it can be quite a nice way to check for gaps and stuff like that. What tends to happen in lots of people's houses is the loft insulation gets done, but then over the years the electrician comes in and moves it all around because he's doing some cable stuff, and somebody else comes in and moves stuff. And often over time you just end up with large parts with no insulation in them. So the images on the screen are from thermal imaging cameras where the darker colors indicate colder spots. And you can see, I think in the bottom image where there's actually no insulation in that wall at all, and you can actually see the bits of wood that make up the wall itself. Oh, where have you gone?
Oh,
What are
don't
you
know what you
doing
did
to me?
there. Sorry, Steve. There you go.
And then the image at the top on the right, you can sort of see in the loft where there's just bits of insulation that's been missing over the years. So again, depending on where you are, I think in North Somerset, certain libraries have them. There are becoming more and more common now where you can go and borrow them and take a look around your home. Can be a bit confusing, but it also can be quite a nice visual way of looking out for things like this. So yeah, just reiterating, adding insulation doesn't solve damp problems, and adding insulation, some places are relatively simple if you've got a nice flat ceiling and you can do your loft. Others can be more difficult and risky, such as wall insulation. So it's yeah, just keeping that in mind.
Hmm. Okay, I remember we said we would do this one quite quickly,
Okay,
but um, do you want me to do that one?
I could try if you want quick. Um, Solid walls. So I'm guessing most of you, by the looks of the ages of your building, will have solid walls. Cavity walls are typically more modern sort of homes. Um, Annoyingly, there are older cavity walls. It really does depend upon where you are. I think that's why we've used the map of the wind-driven rain a few times. Because if you're in an area with lots of wind-driven rain, then you might need to be careful when it comes to insulating your walls, whether that be a solid wall or a cavity wall. So cavity walls were originally designed to use less materials, but also the idea was the outside bricks could get wet, but because there was a gap between the two, the inside would always stay dry. So sometimes if you fill all the cavity, it may cause problems where it actually drags the moisture across and it gets the inside layer of bricks damp. So yes, I think it's often sold as a sort of easy thing to do, but it does really depend upon where you are and your particular situation and your exposure. So there we go, the maps again.
Yeah, so I guess in our area, depending on how close you are to the Severn and maybe how high up you are,
Yeah, and it
depends
is
about your
different. You
exposure.
can be in
Yeah.
an area on this map with quite high exposure, but you can be in quite an enclosed place, so it might not be an issue. So yeah, it all comes back to your house and your house approach, whole house approach. I think we've already touched on, yeah, flat ceilings are fairly simple. Sloping
Mhm.
ceilings can be a bit more tricky because quite often you can't physically get to the gap. So it can often mean you need to take parts of your ceiling down or parts of your roof off. So yeah, sometimes it might make more sense if you're doing it as part of a larger program of works. Yeah. And that's because we need to ventilate wood. It seems like a strange slide, but we do need cross ventilation, not only in our loft space, but under our floors as well. Um, and often people, if they do have sloping ceilings and they've tried to insulate them, what they do is they sort of stuff as much insulation down the gaps as they can, and that can then lead to problems because there's no air circulation within your loft space. and that can cause moisture problems, and that can cause your timber in your roof to rot, which is not a good thing. So just bearing in mind, yeah, the
So what
devil's
would you
in
do in that situation, Steve? Sorry, yeah, devil's in the details,
devil's
but
in the
what would
details.
you do?
If you've got a flat ceiling, you still need to be careful at this junction here where the ceiling meets the walls, and you do, I think it is shown on here. Yeah, in the red, it's got an arrow there where the airflow can still go over, and fresh air can enter your roof space.
Hmm. I guess similarly to the floors, this is the last slide before
Yeah.
our break as well.
Okay, so yeah, if you live in a older house, you might have air bricks, funny little bricks in the bottom of your house with little holes in, and that's for the same thing. It's to maintain what's known as cross ventilation underneath your floor. Quite often these get blocked up, and what can happen if they do get blocked up is um, yeah, humidity levels rise and you start getting issues with your floor timbers. And it's actually just happened in my house where the floor actually rotted and we needed a new floor. So, yeah, just be careful with
Check
that.
your air bricks.
Yes, check your air bricks.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, but this is a free online tool that suggests other issues you should think about depending on what measure you're putting in. So, on the screen here, this orange section is an example of one measure. I think it's window draft proofing, and how it then links to technical concerns, heritage concerns, or energy concerns with your ventilation, heat distribution, chimneys and doors. Actually, I think I've got it up on the website so we can just look at this live. Oh, here it is. Great.
Yeah, and it's quite fun because you can click on, if you click on like Windows, replacing Windows or something.
Let's go secondary glazing.
Yeah, so it just sort of highlights those knock-on effects. And it tells you about things to think about. So it's one of those tools that's been around for a long time, and it's still used by lots of people because it is quite helpful. So do check it out.
So yeah, linking back all of those different elements that we've talked about to this whole house approach, and thinking about how everything affects each other, everything affects everything else in your building. Okay, so heating and hot water controls. So these are a few different ways that you can control your hot water and your heating system to make it more energy efficient. You've probably come across some of these, but we'll just briefly explain them anyway. Programmers and timers are a great way to control when your heating comes on and off in your house. There are some examples of different programmers on the screen there. There's also thermostats. So a thermostat will change the temperature in your house depending on what temperature the thermostat is. So it's quite important to make sure that your thermostat is not, for example, on a wall that gets direct sunlight on it, or your thermostat will think that your house is very hot. It's also a good idea to not have your thermostat in a corridor that you don't use very often, because the thermostat will say your house is very cold, even if your living room is perfectly warm. So making sure your thermostat is in the right place and is used properly is a great way to just be more efficient with your heating system. There's also TRVs. There's a picture of them on this far side. You will have seen them as little knobs on the side of your radiators if you have radiators. They're thermostatic radiator valves. So they will control the flow of hot water to your radiator. So if you have a room that you don't use very often, you can turn down the heating manually using the TRV in that room. Weather compensation. So, Steve, I am completely blanking on this one.
Okay. It's that's fine. It's one of those things that's actually probably quite a good idea to consider, even if you're not looking at a new heating system. So weather compensation came in with condensing boilers, I think in the 80s. And the idea is it's a little temperature sensor that sits outside, again, not in direct sunlight. And what it does, if it's quite a mild day, It tells your boiler it's actually not that cold outside today. You don't need to work as hard. You don't need to try and push as much heat into the building because it's not actually losing much heat. But then also when the weather gets colder, it will talk to your boiler and it will say it's actually a bit colder today. You might need to pump a bit more heat in there because you're going to be losing more heat. So it's a simple enough, cheap enough thing to do that's really good with gas boilers. It's also, I think, standard practice now with heat pumps. It's just something that people don't know much about.
Mm. And so then smart heating controls, that is things like smart meters, I suppose, and people's heating systems can be linked through an app on their phone, or systems that might automatically have thermostats in different rooms and automatically adjust the heat based on a setting you've preset for.
Yeah, it can get a bit confusing with all the different options. Particularly, it can be a problem if you just keep adding more and more controls, because quite often then they end up fighting with each other. So yeah, I've seen lots of things with different heating engineers where they actually go into people's homes and remove bits, and it makes it more efficient. So it really is about understanding what you've got and how it works.
Hmm. Even in my own house, we just have TRVs and a thermostat. And if I've if the thermostat thinks that the house is cold, the house probably is cold. But I've turned down my TRVs because I'm trying to save energy, then the thermostat is going to tell my boiler to work so hard, but none
And
of
you
it's going
need
to
to
come out the
turn down
radiators
the
because I've
heat, turn down the temperatures on your boiler.
mm, yeah, that's poor management on my part.
So this looks like a lot.
It's really
I-
just a couple of tips that we thought would be
yeah,
important for the
I
slides.
suppose it's just remember that radiators are convectors, not radiators. When you dry things on your radiators, not only are you releasing water vapor, you're also sort of insulating the radiator so that your radiators are not going to be heating your rooms as well. Um, Gas boilers, combi boilers, they're supposed to be condensing boilers. If the temperature on them is set too high, then they won't condense and then they're not actually working very efficiently. So it's important to sort of try and understand that. I think there's a website, Home Heating Hub, that has lots of really good stuff on um, different adjustments you can make to your heating systems. And yeah, the next bit is condensing boilers should operate at a lower temperature. Often they're not because they're not set up that way. So it's one of those things, if you are having your boiler service, just ask them, yeah, what temperature is my heating system set to? Can it be turned down a tiny bit? And boilers marketed at 90% efficient will not necessarily be that efficient if your system is not set up in such a way. So don't always believe, oh, it's really efficient. It's got an A rating on the sticker. It's not the efficiency of the individual thing, it's the efficiency of the whole system.
And so, speaking of heating systems, we're going to briefly talk about heat pumps and solar and a few other different forms of heating and hot water. And we thought we'd just start with this as an overview of the carbon emissions that are emitted per kilowatt of heat for a few different um, forms of low carbon heating and fossil fuel heating there. So
It's
gas boilers,
interesting.
yeah. No, go
Yeah,
on,
no,
Steve, go on.
it's interesting here because so the dark red bit, that's the sort of error margin. So if you've got it badly set up or really properly set up, it will influence its efficiency and therefore its CO2 um, emissions. So you can see even with a badly set up heat pump, it's still performing in terms of carbon a lot better than the best performing gas boiler. And I just thought it was quite interesting. Biomass boilers, there's quite a big margin of error in them. Whether they're sustainable or not depends sort of largely where you get your source of biomass from. Um, so yeah, heat pumps are a good thing to be looking for. And if you can try and remove fossil fuel heating, then that is obviously quite a good thing to do.
Hmm. And I think we might have touched on this earlier with the embodied carbon, but a really efficient heating system that you have now, you probably should run it to the end of its days and then try and think about new heating rather than if you're concerned about the upfront cost of putting in new heating. Or is that, do you disagree, Steve? Go on.
Depends on your motivation, I suppose.
Depends on your motivation. Yeah.
And it also, I think with things like that, it's really hard because it sort of depends what there's grant funding for at the time. Because if there happens to be a grant and you happen to be doing lots of other work in your house, then it might make sense to do that at the time. And I think that's where we always try to say it will depend. It'll depend on your circumstances and other people's circumstances. So yeah, there's no silver bullets or one size fits all here.
So with heat pumps, I'm not sure if anyone in the call today has a heat pump, is thinking about a heat pump, has heard lots of news about heat pumps, but isn't really sure about them.
No, not much.
They're kind of hot right now, I suppose.
Yeah, lots of different confusing articles in the media. I suppose just to be clear, you can heat any building with a heat pump, even a tent if you wanted to. It's all about the amount of heat you're putting into a building and the amount of heat that's getting lost in a building. I think we've got a couple of interesting blogs and videos on CSE's webpage. There's also, for those of you that have older buildings, there's also lots of really good advice and guidance on this on Historic England's website. So yeah, they're not a new technology. They're actually older than gas combi boilers. I think the first office building in the UK to be heated with a heat pump was in the 1920s. And they are common sights in offices, petrol stations, pubs, hotels. So yeah, they're not really a new technology. It's just sort of new that we're thinking about them more in homes these days. A few different sort of kinds. There's a water source heat pump where it extracts heat from water. We've got air source and we've got ground source. Yeah, there are a few different considerations around if you might need to make any changes to your existing heating system, but it's quite difficult to say because that will depend on what existing system you already have. So if you are thinking about this, it's worth starting a conversation with a heating engineer and sort of thinking about what you've got and what changes you might need to do if you are looking to make the switch.
Actually, I think this slide explains that quite well. By saying that you should start by ruling out what would not work in your circumstances.
John, that's an interesting comment in the chat there. Told the plumbing wasn't right, and yeah, lots of disruption. It's a really hard one, because that might be true, it might not. It might just be the heating engineer that you spoke to. There's lots of, I suppose, vested interests here from fossil fuel companies, but not just them. I think there's a lot of heating engineers that have been trained and have worked with gas boilers for a long time and don't really want to go and get trained up to figure out how to do heat pumps. And I think there's quite a bit of confusion out there. But yes, I know there was some open homes events that Bristol Energy Network were doing a couple of weekends ago, and I think there was a lot of heat pump skeptics that turned up and quite interested to find out that there was actually quite a few people that had heat pumps in their houses and it was working quite well. But yes, I think this slide here is sort of trying to say that. So we've got ground source heat pumps, which is the GSHP, water source heat pumps. That doesn't mean that they're not viable. I suppose it's just the way you would start in considering a heat pump for a building or any form of heating system for a building is having a look what might be possible. For example, a water source heat pump will probably not be viable if you don't have a source of water nearby. A biomass boiler might not be viable if you live in an urban area because you might not be allowed to be burning wood. So it's all dependent on yeah, keep everything in mind and then slowly work out which ones aren't suitable, and then hopefully you end up with a few that would be viable for your home. Warren, that's an interesting question. Um, Again, I hate to frustrate you by saying maybe. I went to a community building in London the other week and they'd done exactly that. So they've got an air source heat pump, but they've kept their old gas boiler. And then if it gets to a point where it does go below zero, then yeah, the gas boiler can kick in and help out with some of the load. It's not to say that heat pumps can't work in cold weather. Again, it depends on how they're set up. But obviously, the colder the outside air gets, the less efficient they become. Um, I have come across buildings where they have heat pumps and then have other forms of top-up heating. It's particularly a common one for people that have got wood burners and such like. So I think it's just trying to encourage people to think there's more than one way of heating our home. It doesn't just have to be gas central heating, which most of us have known for a while, and just trying to keep an open mind that other things can work. Right, Kate.
On to solar? Yeah, so I guess solar, we're very familiar with gas heating systems, and I feel like we're also fairly familiar with solar by now, or you see it around quite commonly. So there are actually two different kinds of solar. There's solar PV for electricity and solar thermal, which is the black tubes of water on your roof. So you can use solar thermal to heat hot water only, not electricity. And just some things to think about if you're looking to install solar. Don't install what you can't use. Is can be something that's useful to think about. Some people install solar with a battery to store the electricity that they don't use. We'll talk more about batteries shortly, though. You can sell electricity back to the grid if you don't use everything that you make, but that is not as profitable as it once was when
Yeah.
there were feed-in tariffs.
And I think that don't install what you can't use, but I think that's just to be mindful that obviously if you speak to a solar installation company, they're going to try and sell you as many solar panels as they can. So it's just bearing in mind that salespeople sell things, and it will come back to when you're using electricity. So if you're in the home during the day quite a lot and you're using lots of electric, then that makes lots of sense to have solar panels on your roof. If not, then maybe it's a different consideration, and it'll depend where you are. But I'll let you carry on, Kate.
Yeah, no, you're completely right. So, if you do have excess electricity from solar panels, you could export it to the grid. You could also use it to heat a hot water tank. So if you have an inversion heating hot water tank, um, the solar could do that during the middle of the day. And there's also the question of, I mean, similarly with any installation of a new product, there's the question of the embodied carbon in the manufacturing of those products. This point in the middle about shading on buildings and trees reminds me, Steve, that we didn't put Solar Wizard in here, so I'm just going to Google it immediately. But the Center for Sustainable Energy has recently created this free online tool where any address in, oh gosh, it's definitely in Weka, isn't it?
It's in lots of different regions. Yes, I can't remember all the different lists. I suppose the caveat here is this is very much designed as a simple tool for homeowners to use. So I wouldn't put my postcode in and say, right, this tool has said I can have this amount of solar panels, because yeah, solar installers will use a tool that requires more information on about the tilt of your roof, any shading, and any different other considerations. So this is very much a sort of simple, quick search to let you know if it's worth considering, I suppose.
Yeah, so that could be a useful tool if you just want to have a look out of interest or share with people near you out of interest. Obviously, you then need a professional survey. This then uses some very general public data and ONS data to say this is the potential of your roof. we'll include that in the email of resources out afterwards. But the moral of the story is do consider shading on your roof and whether your roof is suitable for solar. And here, there's a free tool that could maybe help you start thinking about that.
And don't forget birds.
Yes, very good point. Thanks for reminding me, Steve. It is important that solar panels are bird proofed because birds like to nest you can see in the bottom solar panel, there's like a raised section underneath the solar panel that would be perfect for a pigeon to nest in, make a lovely little dry wooden twiggy nest that might catch fire.
I think
So,
it's more of a worry that birds can mess with cables and stuff as well. So
mm,
it actually happened at We the Curious, the museum in Bristol. So it's just something to keep in mind. We've got another interesting question in the chat about how much efficiency is lost on solar panels when they're not cleaned. Is there a guide on how often they should be cleaned? That's an interesting one. And I think I would have said in the past, yes, you need to clean them. Somebody else has since told me you don't, but I think it depends on what sort of, yeah, where they are and what you're getting done. One of the things I've noticed over the years is you tend not to see them so much in coastal places, and I think that's because lots of planning authorities and local councils recognise there's lots of issues with seagulls and bird droppings on them. And it is just one of those things to consider. Yeah, how do you actually maintain them and how do you clean them? So yeah, just another thing to keep in mind.
right. This is the last slide before our final summary. But electric battery storage. So this is something that even internally at the Center for Sustainable Energy, there's been strong discussions about what should we say about battery storage. And it kind of does come down to what we've said here. So having a battery can be ideal for households who have solar. So then the battery is storing the solar that's been generated during the middle of the day when you're out and you're not using it. And it can be brilliant for saving money on your bills if you can store electricity when it's cheap. So if you're on a tariff that varies, you can save electricity from off-peak periods. Some people use electric cars as batteries for that as well. So an electric car is essentially working the same way. There's a need to consider the fire safety as well. Where are you going to put your battery? Is it fire safe? But then on the other hand, we also need to consider the high embodied carbon and environmental impact from manufacturing. Obviously, fossil fuels have a high embodied carbon and environmental impact. So yeah, but there's no clear right or wrong here for me. What do you think, Steve?
No, it's been interesting listening to the pros and cons. I think, and yeah, I suppose it does depend on your motivation. Depends how you're going to use electricity. I mean, an ideal world at a sort of a greater level, at a community level, at a sort of national level, we get better at storing energy. It's definitely something we need to find better ways to do. Whether it makes sense for everybody to have a battery in their house, I'm not sure. Oh, we've just had another question in the chat. Air source heat pumps, they use between 12 and 14 kilowatt. Why not invest that into direct electric underfloor heating? Interesting point on the size of the air source heat pump. So I've been told two different figures. Somebody's told me the average air source heat pump fitted in homes is 6 kilowatts. Somebody else has assured me it's actually 8 kilowatts. So for people that are getting 12 and 14, I'm maybe they're on the big side, which I believe is actually less of an issue these days because it is quite easy to sort of modulate them down, meaning they're not using all of that kilowatt capacity. You've had 3 quotes for 12 and 14. What sort of house do you live in? Okay, square meterage. Are we talking old here? Are we talking new? Okay, 1920s. Okay, we've got an interesting case study on our website. I think it's called "Can You Fit Heat Pump in a Listed Building?" So it was a project we worked on last year. where we were doing measured heat loss, and we went into a building that was built in, I think it was the 1880s. It was a stone building, solid walls. It had single glazing with some curtains and shutters and blinds and things. It did have loft insulation, but it didn't have any floor or wall insulation. And when we measured the heat loss, it was suitable for a 7 kilowatt heat pump. But I suppose it's worth bearing in mind that that's only heating and not hot water, so you'd need a tiny bit more for that. I think that comes back to the way that we calculate heat loss and our EPCs. I think that it's quite a crude tool. A lot of heat loss calculations. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not saying that the quotes you've had are wrong, but I would say, have they done heat loss calculations? If so, what assumptions have they made? I mean, it might be that that is what's required. It might be that that's not, and people are just, I think people are still a bit wary of undersizing a heat pump and then you chasing the installer because it hasn't worked. So yeah, direct electric underfloor heating. It's definitely a thing. I suppose the thing to bear in mind with heat pumps is they do have the potential to be a lot more efficient. So for every 1 kilowatt of electricity they use, they can give anywhere between 3 and 5. I have been speaking with somebody who reckons he can get 7 kilowatts out of 1 kilowatt of heat, sorry. So they use electric a lot more efficiently than direct electric. But that's not to say that electric underfloor heating isn't suitable for some. I suppose you need to bear in mind is does that not defy the laws of thermodynamics? With regards to which bit? Again, the EPCC, that's not. I wouldn't really use that to judge how much heat loss your building actually loses. The 1 kilowatt in the one color that I. Oh, okay. No, the whole thing of a heat pump is because of the way it works. I think that's why everybody's trying to encourage people to use them, is because, yeah, for the amount of electric they can use, they can be ideally at least 300% efficient, whereas, yeah, direct electric would only be 100% efficient. Okay, there's lots of chat coming in here. I would say if you want to ask more questions afterwards, then maybe we can have a look at specifics and talk specifics. It just is quite difficult without seeing the house.
Great. Did you have any last thing you want to say about battery storage, Steve, before we go to the summary?
No.
But it is really good to see all the questions, and yes, getting your head around how heat pumps work is a big one. So to wrap up tonight, we've gone through so much tonight, so thank you for sticking with us for the whole hour and a half. It is important to take a whole house approach when you're thinking about moisture and heat and how your home loses heat and how your home moves moisture through it. It's also important to think about the thermal comfort of the occupants. So when you're considering draft proofing or double glazed windows or any number of other measures, it's what will make it comfortable for the users of that home specifically. Understand what you have and how it's used. So that refers to your heating system, getting to grips with what your current heating system is before adding in new things or taking things away as well. And don't overlook the small things. The same as last week. Repair, maintenance, dealing with defects first, especially when we're thinking about moisture. And lastly, the point of doing it like this is so that you can balance the many contradictory goals that you have as best as you can. So next time, what we're going to, I don't have the whole list in front of me, but next time we are going to talk a little bit about some of the laws and regulations and things to consider specifically with listed buildings in conservation areas. And we'll also go through a home survey that you can use to look at your house. So it's basically a checklist walking around your house and considering the state of repair and state of the measures that you currently have in your house as you look around. And then what you can do with all that information after you've got it. So thank you for joining tonight, and we look forward to seeing you for part 3.